Let me welcome all of you with a very good afternoon to this another wonderful event provoked by Montek's article again, a very thought-provoking one, on the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework and its implications and potential for India. Uh, the genesis of today's webinar lies in a thought-provoking article on IPEF, written by Montek in late May in the Mint newspaper, on which Cuts ran a debate on our e-list, and most of our panelists here have participated in that debate as well. We received diverse comments and opinions from a range of experts, sparking off a conversation on this very important topic. Today, we are taking this conversation forward by bringing leading experts on our platform to weigh in on the debate surrounding the IPEF. The objective of today's session is to examine the opportunities presented by IPEF and discuss measures to realize its potential for India. This will help us to design a practical roadmap for the government of India to pursue with regard to the IPEF. And we're glad to see that Dr. Badrinayan from Niti Aayog is here, so our policy conduit, as well as Gopal Agarwal, the economic spokesperson for the BJP. We hope that these conversations will be reflected in the policy as it evolves, who are two friends who are here. It is important to note that as of now, only the process to establish the IPEF has been launched. The actual framework will develop as negotiations under its 4 pillars: trade, supply chains, clean energy, decarbonization, and infrastructure, and tax and corruption proceed further. In line with this, a virtual ministerial was hosted just last week, while the American readout was typical diplomacies, declaring a collective goal, to pursue a high standard and inclusive economic framework through ongoing and intensified engagements, unquote. There was silence from India on this. IPEF has been conceived by its founding members to prepare our economies for the future. But India is equally right in asking what will the IPEF mean for our present. So far, there has been more debate on the form of IPEF rather than on its possible content. Questions have been focused more on whether or not it is or can shape up to be a trade agreement, how it compares with the existing arrangements like RCEP and CPTPP, and how far it is yet another geo-economic tool proposed by the Americans to meet their geopolitical goals. Today, I hope we can address some issues of content, particularly from the Indian standpoint. India appears to be keenest to pursue the IPEF pillars of supply chains, clean energy, decarbonization, and infrastructure. By the way, there's another debate we're running on another of Montek's brilliant articles on India's trade policy, which he wrote inspired by a book written by Amita Batra, who will also be joining the panel later. And there's another debate, so that there's less confusion, and there's excellent debate which is going on this particular issue, particularly on supply chains and so on. Now, what will it take India to participate in the IPEF trade pillar, which is driven by American notions of worker-centric approaches and emphasis on digital trade? We are privileged to have a top-notch panel with us today to discuss these issues. Let me welcome and thank Gopal Agarwal, Badrinayan, Ranganathan, Professor Preetam Banerjee, and two more extremely distinguished panelists who have joined us at the last moment and will gain from the participation: Deepak Mishra, the Director General of CEO of ICREER, and Amita Batra, Professor in JNU. She'll be coming in a little late. Deepak has already joined us. As the author of this forward-looking piece, which sparked off the idea for this discussion, Montek has kindly agreed to deliver the keynote address today. Thank you once again, everyone, for joining us today, and I look forward to a productive discussion. Now, to the audience at large, including to the panelists, please type in your questions or comments in the chat box, which can be taken up in the Q&A session following this discussion. Now I hand over to Montek for his keynote. Montek, you have approximately 20 minutes for your keynote.
That's thank you very much.
15 minutes if you would like to do it, whichever way you do.
Thank you, Pradeep. Can I be heard by everybody?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Well, you mentioned two pieces that I've written, so I think a lot of this might overlap.
Yes.
First of all, I want to thank Pradeep for organizing this session. And I also want to thank him for putting the piece on the Plan 21 email group, which I found very informative, and it triggered a lot of commentary. Invariably, when that happens, people are speaking from a particular point of view, and therefore you need to sort of separate out these different comments. My basic objective was to plug the line, which I have consistently plugged, that India needs to be much more open and to be a little bit risk taking and integrate with the global economy and have a little more confidence in its own producers and their ability to respond to challenges, and not be over kind of cowed down by the more defensive producers who invariably want to sort of say, no, we're not ready for opening up. So I mean, that's my initial position, which I want to lay down on the table. Second, I have on a number of occasions expressed concern that there's a discontinuity between the objectives of trade policy, which are sometimes stated officially, and what we're doing. Officially, we want to be open, we want to integrate with the world, we want to have a good export performance, we even want to integrate with global value chains. But the policy that we're actually following, in the last few years, we've raised customs duties. Our duties were higher than that of other East Asian countries, even to begin with. I mean, we lowered duties, but not as much as we should have, and we've now raised them in the last 3 or 4 years. Second, we seem to be a little hesitant to go in for a global value chain arrangement, which involves pretty free and kind of unrestricted movement of components across borders. I mean, the definition of global value chain, I mean, something is a member of the global value chain if a product crosses two boundaries. And I think if we need to address this question, do we have in mind simply being a source of exports where the entire value chain is domestic, so that the export has a very high domestic value and of course it's exported? Or do we want to participate in a global value chain where basically things are produced in different places, moved across borders, value is added, and they're moved further on? If we're serious about global value chains, and I think we should be, that's really what we have to do. And therefore, this focus on what is the value added at each stage, which I think some commentators have raised, is in my view not relevant. I think one of the key things we have to recognize is that global value chains are actually, so to speak, constructed by lead companies which actually control all the IPR and critical supplier companies. Now, the lead companies are the ones who actually deal with the critical suppliers and sort of basically place orders on them. And they probably also decide where the assembly is going to take place. And then the whole thing is parceled out with further downward delegation and so on. Now, in this process, I think we have to recognize that ease of movement across borders and minimization of procedural hassles is absolutely critical. And I think if you're not a member of a trading arrangement, which has sort of come to a common understanding on a whole lot of procedural things, you will not get this sort of seamless movement of items across borders. So I think what's happening is we don't seem to be tying all these things together. To my mind, what I had said in both those papers, I was very pleased that we seem to be following up on the signal which the Prime Minister had given that we must act east, not just look east. And frankly, after 6 years of negotiation, everybody expected that when the Indian delegation went to Bangkok in November, they would sign up on the RCEP. For whatever reason, and I'm not privy to it, so I can only speculate, we decided at the last minute not to sign up. I think that was a missed opportunity. Now, it's possible, according to many people in the press, that industry was opposed to the RCEP because they feel that RCEP includes China and we just can't compete with China. Now, I don't actually happen to agree with this view because other countries are competing in the global value chain. So quite honestly, if they can do it, why can't we? And I think RCEP had a fairly long transition period so that if there were domestic constraints that prevented our guys from becoming competitive, we would have had enough time to get over them. I think that for whatever reason we didn't. And then my feeling was that since we have joined the IPEF, which is a different grouping, it's not just the Quad, it's a Quad and a few other countries, but not all the ASEAN are there, etc. Since we have joined the IPEF, in the trade pillar, in case the trade pillar moves to market access. Now, I want to emphasize, I'm aware that it is not at the moment a market access pillar. But a lot of people feel that when these things are created as pillars, it's because some people think it should become market access. They have political constraints in the United States. I don't believe in the United States there's any support for signing a plurilateral trade agreement right now. But these things take a couple of years to negotiate, and the situation may change 2 or 3 years down the road. So my view was we should encourage the trade pillar becoming a trade agreement. And I also made the point that we should be very clear that future trade agreements will not be about removing barriers at the border, like tariffs and so on. They will be about behind the border integration of standards of various kinds, including, of course, intellectual property, environment, labor, and so on. Now, historically, I know that our negotiators have always resisted any effort to expand the range of agreements behind the border. I think we should give up this concern because I think increasingly trade in future is going to be between societies that are more integrated with each other. And this is being magnified by the geopolitical change that has taken place. I mean, what the geopolitical change has done is created a fracture with China, Russia on one side and the others on the other side. Now, I know that many people who have commented have sort of said, look, this looks like a departure from our historical non-aligned traditions. Some have even said that the US is a very unreliable partner, which is, by the way, quite true. I mean, the US, of all countries, maybe because it has been the hegemon for so long, believes in US exceptionalism. I mean, there is no rule of trade that the US genuinely believes that it has submitted itself to. After all, the Special 301 is a complete violation of GATT, but they have it. It's just because they're so important, nobody complains too much. And I think there's a reality there that we really have to accept. Given all that, I think my view would be that within IPEF, we should encourage the trade pillar becoming an actual trade agreement. I see newspaper reports which suggest some lack of clarity because some of our officials have said, but this is not meant to be for market access. That's true. But I think since we have a foot in there, on balance, we are better off expanding it to market access. Now, if you don't want to do that, then the only alternative is to join the CCPT, which is what is left over from the Trans-Pacific Agreement, which is now led by Japan, and that doesn't have China. Neither IPEF nor this other one have China. So if our dominant concern was China, then we should definitely join one of these two. The idea that we will stay out of trade agreements while the rest of the world, for whatever reasons, is going down the route of trade agreements, in my view, would be totally self-destructive. So that's really the background. I I just want to make one point that in some of the discussions, there are a few issues that have come up. Some people have said that, look, trade policy by itself is not going to be the answer. It has to be supported by industrial policy of some kind. That's absolutely true. I mean, trade performance is not just a function of trade policy. I mean, if you have lousy procedures and you have lousy infrastructure, but you have a perfect trade policy, you're going to get nowhere. So I have no doubt whatsoever that trade policy should be supported by very significant policy initiatives in these areas. But my point is that by entering into a trade agreement, you compel the system to adjust. I mean, that is really what China did. I mean, there were people in China who were not very happy about joining the WTO, but the Chinese judged that joining the WTO would create a pressure domestically to change because we joined the WTO. Now, I think we have never done that. And I think that's a mistake. We should do that. And we should enter into these agreements knowing that trade policy by itself is not going to solve the problem. But the only way you're going to get high level attention to these problems is if you've joined into a trade agreement, because then you can say that, look, what are all these other people doing? Now, I realize that infrastructure takes a long time to develop, but procedures don't take a long time to develop. And I mean, we've been talking about this now for years. There is absolutely no earthly reason why we cannot, within 6 months, prepare a set of procedures which, for our condition, would basically make the Indian procedures world class. Now, I think this is really the background that I had in mind. I'm quite happy to yield the floor at this point, and let's see how the discussion proceeds. Okay?
Thank you very much, Montek. That was a sharp 15 minutes. Excellent. And may I now, we've also been joined by Amita Batra, who I saw walking in. So we have a full panel of about 6 panelists.
Can I make one point? This is a factual point that I think needs to be put across. That is, if we are interested in being a dynamic performer on the export front, we should recognize that in the last 3 or 4 years, our performance has deteriorated. And according to an ADB report, which I thought was very good, really. Hi, Amita. I think you've just joined, so welcome. I recommend her book to all of you. She puts it all down very much more clearly than I have. But I think the ADB report demonstrates that between 2010 and now, in terms of GVC integration, we have deteriorated. And the last point I wanted to make was that the fracturing of the geopolitics, it will certainly have an impact on global trade. The growth of trade is likely to slow down. That's true. But equally, it's likely to get restructured and diversified a little bit away from China. So I don't think we should make the mistake, which some people make, that globalization is dead and why are we now going on with it? The fact is that the first stage of globalization has run its course. A new stage is now reopening. And that's a stage in which there will be an active desire to diversify away from China. That's a big opportunity for us, but we won't be able to benefit from those opportunities if we don't accept some of the things that are needed in order to do well in the area of GVCs. And I certainly think that excessive preoccupation with value addition at each stage is wrong. And I think we should recognize that our tariffs are too high. And certainly on procedures, we need to radically improve them as soon as we can. Thank you.
Thank you, Montek. Incidentally, on your second article debate, Deepak Mishra has made some excellent comments, among other excellent comments coming from Harsh and so on. And I'm sure he'll come back to that. Uh, Deepak and Amita, if you may miss the opening remarks, there is a second article of Montek which is also being debated by all of us. So let there not be a confusion between one and the other. There are a lot of overlapping areas, like the last one that Montek spoke about in terms of GVC and so on. Now, may I now we have 6 panelists, so I was requesting you to speak for about 7 to 8 minutes, and then come back for about 2 minutes before we open the floor. Now, the second round of 2 minutes is for you to respond to points which you may have forgotten or respond to some other panelists on any issue that the other panelists may have raised. That's how I've structured it. And the audience, again, you're welcome to, and you are invited to send your comments and questions through the chat box. Thank you very much. So over to you, Dr. Ranganathan. Dr. Ranganathan, I hope you have slides which look quite good, and I hope you can do it within 7 minutes.
Thank you. Let me.
Can you put up the slides?
Yes. Can your office put up the slide, please?
Oh, there it is. It's coming up.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. First of all, thank Pradeep for asking a naysayer among this group. I started looking at where we have been with the group and where we have stayed away, and can we take some lessons from there? Earlier, we were famous for non-alignment, which actually was perceived as pro-USSR. And we had this nuclear explosion, first by Mrs. Gandhi and then Vajpayee. At that time, the technology support was cut off. ISRO had problems. Even existing contracts were not honored by US. Then there was a sea change. Indo-US Accord was there, and it must be said here that US was more interested than India itself. And then one has to see, some people said it is for the business opportunity, $20 billion or so is at stake, like for GE, etc., where they were not having any scope in their own country. Everybody was closing down nuclear plants. So can they have some opportunity here? But then my own view was this was peanuts. This is not really the motivation. Motivation was more to, give a pinprick to China. And as you know, that China has got some 4 or 5 times the number of nuclear warheads and delivery systems as India. And therefore, this cooperation would sort of, be a concern for China at least. Then we had the Quad, which is actually based on a common unease with China. Here again, we say on the one hand, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, and then should we do this? We and they, in the long run, these things don't, as somebody said, in UK, Britain does not have permanent friends or permanent enemies, but only permanent interests. That's what we also should have. But wisely, we stayed away from China's OBOR project. They signaled that we are not a client state for you. We are not your vassals. So IPEF looks a bit similar to Quad, but instead of security, now this is on cooperation. Next, please. Yeah. Now, the various people have said standards will be together, we will be partners in standards. That again is a function of technology, not gone through in terms of cooperation agreements. Digital governance was the next point where there's a divergence from US. You see, opposing views between telecom regulator of India and the US on net neutrality, and then we had offer of free basics by Facebook, which the TRI chairman rejected. So we have a fairly independent point of view. We don't need to be part of a group for this. Then labor rights, markets will overrule any inter-country understanding, I would say. Sorry. Specific issues can be, my point is, specific issues can be agreed upon on a case-to-case basis, but not as a boxing ourselves into things which are not necessary. Next one, please. So this point has already been made by Montek himself that US is a strong unilateralist. They freeze other countries' assets and sanctions. So they write the rules and others follow. And in that situation, do we value our sovereignty? And now I'm going to talk mainly on renewable energy.
Dr. Ranganathan, another 3 minutes, please.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, next slide, please. Okay, so in this clean energy, my fear is that IPEF will push India in clean energy path and bankrupt the already ailing power distribution companies. Now, clean energy can be understood as a combination of private good and a public good. The particle pollution is a private good because we suffer, and so we have to take care. But CO2 emission is like a public bad. That means it is open to the tragedy of commons. And in this case, I would say, let it be the tragedy of commons, and let us take advantage of that. Because, we, ironically enough, along with America and China, we have the largest coal reserves. Some 280 billion tons, enough for about 50 years or so. So to go in for solar and wind as against coal and hydro, to me, is not the right way to do. Next, please. In fact,
is this your last one? I think, can you skip this and get on to your more political ones?
Basically, I'm saying...
You have just about 1 minute left this time.
Okay. My point is, people mislead you by saying the renewable energy has got almost equal to the cost of coal and hydro, which is not correct because it's an intermittent energy. So even when it goes to the grid, so the capacity is borrowed from hydro and coal, and therefore it will never be the same. And then you may wonder why the private equity fellows are interested in this because they're sure they can arm twist the government, you know. So ironically enough, in India, even without IPEF, we are going for renewable energy, harming ourselves, see? And there seems to be a competition with China. Oh, we are going to do more. We are nowhere near that, but we are going to do more. Our rate of growth is going to be more. Next slide, please.
Sir, you've already spoken for 10 minutes and there are other
Yeah.
panelists also. So if you
Okay.
can come to the more political issue that you wanted to raise. And I invited you particularly because you had many things against the whole thing. So I thought instead of getting deep into renewable energy, etc., which are all granular issues, if you can come to
Yeah.
the political issues.
Political issue is that the having idea that there are groups of people who are forward thinking and then groups of people who are, so that kind of thing doesn't gel. So there are no dictators and there are no free marketers and Democrats, etc. in this. Everybody has got their own issues. So we cannot make the division of good people and bad people and we will join the good people.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Can I move on to Dr. Ranganathan? Thank you very much for this very detailed explanation of your viewpoint. And I wish we had the time in order to go through all these details. But this being more like a panel discussion rather than a seminar, what we have to appreciate and respect is that we need to make some very sharp headlines on the views expressed by Montek in his article as well as in the debate which ran through. With that, over to you, Gopalji. 7 to 8 minutes, please.
Yeah.
Let's have an interactive discussion as far as possible.
I will be very brief.
Please, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia ji and Pradeep ji for this debate and discussion. It's more of a learning for me and understanding the issues. I had been involved in discussions with the government at the time of FTA and RCEP. Pradeep ji also participated in some of our discussions. And after a lot of debate, there was issues which had been decided by the government. I would just like to tell two, 3 points here, Mr. Ahluwalia. One thing is, I think government is very clear on that we want to integrate into global value supply chain, and our trade partnership and agreement and with the European and US is very important. We are interested in signing free trade FTAs and trade agreement with particularly USA, which is a large trading partner for us. So there is no question that we would be out of any negotiation with US on any point of time. But one thing I just would like to mention is about the thing is that what is there on the table for India, that is not very clear to me. I don't know, government might be having that information, but at present in the public domain or my discussions with people is that we are talking upon the concept, and nobody will deny that multiple trade platforms, agreements, integration, bilateral trade agreement, they are very good for any upcoming country or for their economy. So what is there for us on the table is important. Second is that thing is that the government at presently, we are thinking, as Mr. Ahluwalia, you also said that we need to not only look into trade agreements, only trade policy as a issue for economic development. We have to see about our industrial policy, logistic policy, infrastructure policy, e-commerce policy, electronic manufacturing, digital location. All these are very important. And what our industry have been telling with our experience on FTA and thing is that domestically, a lot of reforms are still pending in our economic sector, whether it is land reforms, whether it is labor reforms. We have seen the way agriculture reforms, which were everybody on the economic front agreed, but the political compulsions did not allow those reforms to take place. Even labor notification is pending. So issues of political concern, political economy is very important. And our domestic industries say that first we have to strengthen our logistic cost is so high. So we are working on this route that we have to strengthen our industrial policy. All these policies the government is working on. Due to this COVID and other thing, it has been delayed, but otherwise the government was in a very advanced stage in putting out industrial policy, which is at present only we are following 1948 industrial policy. That has to be amended. It was last amended in 1991. The new policy draft framework is ready, but it has not been implemented. New logistic policy is required so that cost of transportation is reduced. So these are the things that the government at present is thinking. They are also very important and are precursor of then only we can open up the industries to such kind of competitions. But still, we cannot be out of the game and rules of the trade at global levels, because we are not the deciding factor on the rules of the game. Rules of the games are decided by many countries. And the last point that I would like to say is about this, is about the concern. I've seen the discussion. Amrita ji was also there, I think, on the WTO negotiation, etc. And we saw in earlier times when WTO agreements, we were part of that, and agriculture was opened up and included, services was included. How at times those international platforms were used to restrict trade and export from some countries. So whether we have committed on the renewable energy, carbon emission, carbon footprints, but I am also part of the corporate sector and chartered accountant. We have seen this requirements of ESG, environment sustainability, growth, etc., and then all these internalizing environmental costs, etc. At times they are used as a restriction of international trade, because at technological level, even in green hydrogen, etc., technological level we are short. So these are the concerns that also has to be taken care of, that how we build up the standards to meet the global standard which will be set up in these negotiations, which can be counterproductive to some of our industries. This is also a concern which, if the cuts and you are taking this forward, so these concerns can also be looked into the papers instead of focusing only on its importance, which is, I'm very clear that the government is clear on this issue that we need to integrate, but when and how is the question. And the last point I would also mention, for those who are here from the corporate sector or the economic sector or business communities, about the issues of global taxation. We are facing several problems: base shifting, profit transfers. These are very complex situations where a slight changes in the global taxation requirements can be very counterproductive to our resource generation. And these have been used by many countries. So these concerns are also to be incorporated into our digital marketing, electronic manufacturing, e-commerce, all those things, and localization of data. So it's a complex issue that the government is having on its table. So I think these issues, taxation policies, domestic reforms, what is there on the table, how these global standards on emission, carbon footprints are meted out in these negotiations. So with these things, more clarity is required, and platforms like CUTS and etc. can help the government and all of us to understand the nitty-gritty of this. But ultimately, we agree that we have to go to global integration. Our manufacturing sector can only progress where there is a global integration, like automobile industry or pharmaceutical industries, generic medicine, etc. Those industrial sectors where we have integrated with the global industries, we have seen a huge growth in those sectors. So with this,
Thank you very much, Gopalji.
thank you.
Incidentally, you, Monte, Kamita, and many others have been a part of Pritam, for example, have been a part of the debate which we ran on competitiveness. I think that is the point which you wanted to raise. And what is good, I think you should, one must acknowledge government's latest achievement in Gati Shakti. In terms of logistics, the kind of coordinated platform which has been developed is hugely advantageous and cost reduction as well as time achievement. Now, among other things which Monte also spoke about, one of the things which we tend to forget and we should not forget is how do we build human capital in order to improve our productivity and trade both sectors. That's very important. Secondly, on trade policy and industrial policy, we have done a paper on the lack of convergence between one and the other. One ministry, one department talks something, the other department talks something, and we keep on ending into problems. I'll come back to that later. With that, let me now turn to Badri Narayan Gopal Krishnan from the Niti Aayog. Badri, again, 8 to 9 minutes to you.
Sure, thank you very much.
And welcome back to India.
Yeah, thank you very much, Pradeepji. For organizing this. It's a great discussion, and it was wonderful to hear from Mr. Ahluwalia and Dr. Ranganathan and also Mr. Agarwal. So I'll spend these few minutes to talk about the general evolution of trade policy strategy in India, and how does it align with IPEF. Very briefly, as you mentioned, I have around 8 minutes. So have been participating in the multilateral trade negotiations, and many studies and policy analysis they have suggested that we have gained a lot from WTO, like in terms of tariff reduction, in terms of market access, and so on. So that is going on at one level, and we have seen a lot of ups and downs in the WTO. And in the recent past, we were thinking that it's not progressing going anywhere, and finally in this last ministerial we saw some progress. And so that's one aspect. The multilateralism is still alive, and India has always been advocating for rules-based international trading system, transparent. So that is going on at one level. The second thing that is happening is that over time, trade definitely has been expanding. Exports from India has been expanding, and the last year we had the highest export revenue from India. Although some of it is due to the price increases globally, still we do see that the share has increased visibly, India's export share in global trade. So that gives us that's not much of an outcome, but more of a development that provides some confidence and some courage and some kind of export optimism or trade optimism in the trade. So I think these are all some positive things that are happening. And now, of course, the multilateral system has its own challenges. That is why we are, without getting into the details there about it, it's all about how you have different concerns about unfairness, structural concerns. Then there are some procedural concerns, and how tariffs have been falling, but then non-tariff barriers and others are increasing. So those are all different things one can keep discussing at length. But now that overall consistent efforts on multilateral trading system leading to some outcome, but at the same time not progressing much further, has led to many countries to focus on regional trade agreements and professional trade agreements. So now, of course, IPF is not a trade agreement. Trade is not an explicit part of it, and US has very clearly mentioned there will be no tariff reductions, no trade agreement that will be part of this, mainly to avoid the domestic tensions, particularly in the US, because they have to go through the Congress, they have to get the congressional approval and so on. So that is, IPF, but still there is a trade component here. Trade is an important pillar. That's why I'm talking about the overall situation here. So now the recent surge in the interest in PTAs across the world. Across the world, it has been, you can say, a couple of decades. There has been a proliferation of free trade agreements. Of course, there is a lot of debate here as well. The nodal ball effect of the theory that says that when you have too many PTAs with too many rules, that's actually going to be less conducive to trade than it can be a stumbling block rather than a building block. But that's again for another day's debate and discussion. But now in this context, we have now got into the that kind of thought process wherein instead of getting into this, instead of waiting for WTO to succeed, why don't we get into this PTAs? And we had this decision, conscious decision not to participate in Belt and Road Initiative or the RCEP or TPP and so on. So then this is more like what is our answer to the global trade strategies by the global powers. And then we started our own set of PTAs. And with all the trends that I mentioned a minute ago about increasing exports, reduction of export pessimism and so on, we're now in a position to negotiate trade agreements and on a timely basis. So we already have completed, signed a couple of trade agreements, right? So we have UAE and we have an early harvest agreement with Australia. And there are several features which are quite ambitious, which were not that much in the trade discourse before. So again, not getting into the details there, just to state that we are now open to trade, much more open to trade compared to several years ago, and that is a very positive sign. So we are in the business of signing free trade agreements as opposed to negotiating forever and not making any headway. So that is one positive development in the recent, as in the last couple of years, I would say. And secondly, one change in strategy in trade is instead of our past trade agreements that happened a decade or so ago, they were focusing on countries like ASEAN group, where that led to a lot of debate later. Did we really gain from those FTAs or not, and so on. So again, that is again a different debate. One contention that a lot of people had was that these are more like our competitors, and if we sign FTAs with them, then we may lose. I actually agree with Mr. Ahluwalia's point that we cannot do that. I mean, if other countries are competing with them, why not us? So that is there. But still, from a political policy discourse perspective, it makes much more sense to go for the low-hanging fruits, which is like getting into trade agreements with the countries with whom we have complementary kind of relationship, who may not become our effective competitors. So that has been the recent current strategy. So we have UAE, which has Australia, and the UK, EU are all going on quickly. So now, in putting all these different aspects together in the context of IPEF, we have the advantage of having signed, agreements with several members of IPEF already. So we have Australia done recently. We are in fact negotiating a much more comprehensive agreement now with Australia, and we have already ASEAN FTA, which of course is a little contentious, but we have an agreement with them. It is operational, and that is in ASEAN. Now some of the ASEAN countries are also part of IPEF. We have a trade agreement with UK, which is in advanced stages and may be signed in a few, in the near future. With all these things, in place, IPF becomes a great forum for India because we already have these good relationships happening. US, of course, is a
Would you like to conclude?
difficult. Yeah,
It's about 10 minutes, sir.
yeah. Oh, sorry. I'm concluding
No,
now.
not at all. Not at all. What you're saying is excellent, but
Yeah,
if
sure.
there are other panelists, let's hear them also.
I've pretty much come to the
I'll
conclusion.
come back to you.
Yeah. So the broad conclusion I'm saying is that we have the advantage of opening up trade with certain countries, and we are going forward in that direction right now. And IPF is a great opportunity in this context where we can, without getting into the difficulties of market access, tariff reductions, and so on, we can set the scene for the broader trade, promotion of trade between the members, and on that we can take a leadership. However, I'm not touching upon the other pillars because my focus is on trade. Thank you.
No, fair enough. You can come back in the next round of 2 minutes with whatever point you have forgot. Gopalji, just one point to reflect on your issue about taxation. IPEF has taxation as one pillar also, taxation and corruption, by the way. May I now request Preetham? Preetham, over
Thank
to you.
Thank you very much. Am I audible?
Yes.
Thank you, Pradeep ji, for inviting me. It's an honor to be part of this panel. It's a subject very close to my heart, and I will take the liberty to be a little controversial, just to provoke all the august members of this panel. So my contention is that the existing systems, multilateral systems that exist, are perhaps inadequate to deal with some of the issues confronting the new normal in trade. And I think all countries are grappling with ways to kind of deal with it. And IPF is perhaps one step forward in that direction. Why am I saying this? Let me quickly highlight some of the key factors. One, I would call it the China factor. Now, while Montekji's point is right about being able to compete with the Chinese, I think things have changed a lot in the last 1.5 decades. As China has grown in stature, in economic size, and it has dominated value chains, the fact that it is a non-market economy with a lot of opaque market distortionary power is leading to concerns. And the existing multilateral system is not able to quite deal with this. So the question then arises, do we need new structures which exclude China? What is the way we deal with this? The second is the technological transformation. If we think about Industrial 4.0, which is upon us, and there's a massive technological transformation underway in both production and consumption technology, digital and exchange of data will become integral to production, consumption, and every aspect of our lives. So data is not anymore a side topic when it comes to trade, and we'll have to learn to deal with it. So therefore, that's another important point. The second is supply chains. In supply chains during the pandemic and even before that, we saw weaponization of supply chain dominance by certain countries. The question is, whether it's rare earths or semiconductors that we are discussing now, or even in the Indian perspective, our pharmaceutical industry being dependent on the raw materials of basic chemicals and bulk drugs from another country. So these are genuine questions that needs to be dealt with. The other 2 points on environment and labor, I think even recent comments by the Deputy Director General WTO with reference to the carbon adjustment tax has made it very clear that individual countries can, looking at their both indirect tax structure and at the border taxes, impose certain measures, and they will be WTO compatible as long as they don't violate the national treatment and the MFN kind of structures. So this is something we have to grapple with. Countries will start doing it. So how do countries like India deal with it? Last point on labor, exactly the same argument holds. I think the US, Canada, Mexico agreement that Mr. Trump negotiated, those kind of measures can become a vogue, and they'll be WTO compliant. So these are not issues we can hope to avoid. So the question remains that is there a platform or a framework through which India can engage with the important economies of this world also deal with the China question. And there I completely agree with Montek. He said we have to start seeing ourselves as a big economy, which we are, as mature enough to deal with these issues and drive the narrative. If IPF is an alternative platform to at least develop the narratives and structures of how to deal with these problems, then we should be there proactively and not in a passive sense. We should be coming up with solutions with an alternative in digital trade. We have aggressive interest of our own. But the noise that I hear is so defensive. We are one of the biggest exporter of IT and IT-enabled services. We have aggressive market interests in other countries. So data localization, is it really in our interest, or are there constraints that we would want to see in it? So these are the questions we need to grapple with, and I think IPF provides us with an opportunity. The framework, the structure, etc., is being debated. Why can't we also, along with the US, take a lead in it? Now, the other question is, I think two important players in this is India, because it represents one end of the spectrum. The other is the US. What is US's intentions? To that extent, is US mature enough to see it as a strategic alternative by which they can drive an alternative narrative on trade, and also build a coalition that restricts the kind of things we have seen the Chinese do? Or will they treat it as an extension where they can push all their agendas on digital trade, on labor, environmental standards, that was forced down the throat of Canada and Mexicans in the US-Mexico trade agreement? If they do the latter, then it's an immature reaction, because it is, I think, par for the course that most countries in Asia will not accept this. So it's a duck that is dead in the water even before the Americans. I think the Americans have enough maturity to understand and see this. And I think the leading factor that the Americans see it that way is that they have not called it a trade agreement yet. That President Biden has not made it subject to congressional approval. Therefore, insulating it from perhaps the kind of lobbying pressures that would have come otherwise. So these are all indications to me that even the Americans are looking at it as a work in progress. I think we need to be proactive as a country. And last and most important point, which was, I think, mentioned by many speakers, is that our own domestic reforms, whether it's the logistics part of it. We saw that we are now embarking on a more comprehensive response to the whole data privacy and the whole data regulation that we have started work on. All of these domestic reforms to have our own institutions in place has to happen simultaneously, and that's where the cohesion, the government as a whole approach becomes important. The line ministry is kind of undergoing these institutional reforms. Cannot do it in a silo while commerce and industry or MEA engages with these factors in another silo. These conversations need to happen within the government, and I think it's happening to a certain extent. People like Badriji through Niti Aayog can facilitate this further. Only then, when we have connected all the boxes, will we have a comprehensive response and a confident one. It's an opportunity for us to reboot the system that exists, which is failing on many fronts. And I don't think WTO can be the solution for many of these problems. We need alternative platforms, and let IPF be a beginning in that direction. I will end there. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Preetam, for those excellent remarks. And with that, may I now come to Deepak Mishra. About 8 to 10 minutes.
Thank you, Pradeep.
Preetam was the best. He did it in 7 minutes.
Thank you, Pradeep. If you go by the time, hopefully I'll even less than that, and then you have to come and say some complimentary things.
By the way, if I may interrupt you, there are other people from abroad as well watching us, and particularly a friend of ours, an economist from Belgium, Andre Sapir, also wants to speak.
Yeah, I'll be very short. I'm a bit of an accidental panelist. I don't think I was.
No, you're not.
But no, thank you for this. I think let me just begin by saying
and
that
you're not the only one. Amita is also in the same league.
Let me begin by saying that I've on and off working on India trade issues for the last 20 years, and I felt that India has been an unwilling globalizer all its time. Our politicians, economists, policymakers, default position is why open. Why liberalize? There must be some agenda out there. So that has been, and that mindset has not dramatically changed, but obviously it's a real refreshing to see that now the government has the ambition of engaging in so many trade agreements at the same time. I'll make 3 points. I think the first point is, if I look at India's last 2 decades of reform, I do feel that the trade reforms and the domestic reform have often been misaligned. They're not pulling India in the same direction. So, during the early 2000s, in post India 1, with a massive, increase and significant number of trade agreements were signed, but that's also the period when our domestic reforms are slowing down, or there's a bit of a policy paralysis at the end of it. Then it pause where we did a lot of domestic reforms, but very little trade liberalization opening. So I do feel like for trade to work, it needs two to tango. You need trade reform and domestic reforms happening simultaneously to take advantage of it. And India has never moved in both with the two cylinders firing at the same time. So I do feel that this is a really good opportunity, having done a lot of the reforms in the last 6 to 7 years. At least if you look at any of this competitiveness ranking, World Economic Forum, or the defunct World Bank indicators, everywhere you see India has done quite a significant improvement. But so to me, this is a really good time to test our ability to compete globally. So I would say this is a really great time for India to get a much bigger return on the trade reforms than it has ever been in the past. So I would actually join hands with a lot of the people who have an optimistic view about India's trade policy and the impact on it on growth in the future. The second point, which I think Pradeep you mentioned, and I want to bring it that, and I'm actually referring to the second part of the the discussion that you had on the whole trade policy volume and value debate. And I feel like again, our trade policy and industrial policies haven't pulled us in the same direction all the time. In fact, they have been very misaligned. To give you, and I was actually living in Vietnam when Samsung came to set up the factory. And this is between 2010 and 2013. Vietnamese had very little information. They had no plan. It was completely accidental that Samsung decided to come to Hanoi and set their plants, because they were trying to diversify out of China, and they said we need one more plant. Vietnam is close by, the good labor laws, and all sorts of things that it was favorable. Good labor laws in the sense it was favorable to industry, and they moved in. And what was so dramatic is that even the Samsung people had no clue that this is going to become such a big thing. They started with very small investment, but you have to give credit to the Vietnamese government. Trusted Samsung. They basically said, you tell us what you need in terms of things that we need to do, which is kind of the part of the industrial policy, to clear a strong foundation for our electronic sector. And Vietnam had joined the WTO, and they actually kind of went for a sweeping external liberalization over those period of times to make it much easier to become Vietnam a manufacturing hub for many products. So this combination of industrial policy, which was trying to deal with the domestic reforms, and a trade policy, which was about increasing market access and helping Vietnamese firms and the Vietnamese-based firms to export more, were really in sync. And I think in India we haven't done that. A lot of our industrial policies are actually about localization requirement and a whole host of other things, which actually goes against your trade policy. And our trade policy is sometimes about increasing tariff, inverted tariff structure and all, which actually goes against your competitors. So in a sense, that's another big part of the story, which I feel needs to be dealt with as we open up more. And the final point on my side was this whole debate on globalization, localization that we have in India, and the volume and value debate. I think there's a lot of people in this group and others who rightly argue that obviously India should not, when India opens up, it should make sure that it has larger domestic value content in production, because that's what matters for employment and others, which is a good point. But I think when you look at the global history or the economic history of countries which have been very successful in terms of exporting and becoming big global players, what you find is they started with not the objective of trying to do both at the same time. They often did a very sequential approach of first gaining scale, become a big globalizer before they start demanding that there should be a lot more local content. And it takes a lot more time. Trade policy is easy because you open up Whereas the industrial policy is harder. You have to work with the industries to build the ecosystem, which takes much longer. But if you insist on doing both, which India has often tried to do, you are trapped in a low value and low scale equilibrium for a very long time. And I think our electronic sector is a good illustration of that. We export about $10 to $15 billion, and that has been stagnant for the last 10 years. Vietnam has gone from basically 0 to 125 billion in the same period. China has grown from about 200 billion to $900 billion in the same period. So clearly that's a huge part of the story. So while I think the intention is good, that you want to have a lot more domestic value addition, you have to be a lot more strategic. It has to be based on evidence, and it has to be based on country experience. And that tells you that you must first globalize before you insist on localization. That's all on my side. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Deepak ji. That was excellent. And I particularly draw the attention of Gopal Krishna Agrawal. Gopal ji, it would be good if you can get some of your members of parliament to come and listen to this discussion. We are all very positive and very gung-ho about what is happening, but that spirit has to then translate into parliamentarians as well. With that, may I now request Amita Batra, another distinguished panelist, extended one, not accidental.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
I'm very thankful to you and to Deepak for having agreed to join the panel at the last moment.
Thank you. I mean, even if last moment, I think I'm very happy and eager to be here because I think I get to learn a lot on a subject which is of great interest to me and very close to my heart, I must say. It's also good to be here because there are some of the old colleagues I see here, especially Badri, who me and Badri have worked together in ICREER long time back. So it's good to be here and see everybody.
Oh, so there is an ICREER mob here.
Yes, this is a lot of ICREER happening here,
And late Isha, of course.
Yes. So that's one. But coming to the point here, in terms of the IPEF, I'll make a few points, very brief points here. Some in response to what has already been said, but also in terms of the concept as far as IPEF is concerned. As Mr. Agarwal said, it's still a concept, it's still developing. There's nothing really formal, and negotiations have only, I think, informally just begun here. Last one. So what we have here is, what I want to say first is that IPEF in the first place, as far as my focus is on the trade pillar only, is in the first context only being pushed forward as an arrangement, not as an agreement. In a way, it presents a very loose structure as far as the components and the provisions that are going to be negotiated under the IPEF are concerned. In that context, it's not going to be something like RCEP, CPTPP vis-a-vis IPEF. We need to understand that these are going to be two very different animals as far as the regional trade context and regional trade scenario is concerned. So these are not alternatives, and it's also very clear from the fact that many members or many economies, particularly in Southeast Asia, East Asia, that are members of RCEP, chosen to be members also of CPTPP, have their applications in for membership of CPTPP, as well as have chosen to be members as far as the IPEF is concerned. IPEF is guided more by strategic considerations and the geopolitical changes that have happened in the last few years than economics per se, but it's there to provide the economic leg of a strategic structure, that's evolved, more so in terms of the Quad really pushing this forward, That's one. The second bit, in terms of market access not being a part of the IPEF, of course, it doesn't make sense in terms of talking about trade, and the second component in terms of supply chain resilience and not having tariffs as a major aspect of the arrangement as well. Some of us would consider that this is an advantage as far as India is concerned, because India has been reluctant in its earlier trade agreements to cut down on its to offer preferential tariffs on a larger number of lines here. But my submission here is, and this is something that I would like quick work to be done. I haven't as yet been able to look this up, but this is what I read, and this is a quick survey that we do. That as far as, the argument that is being presented, one is, of course, the political argument here in terms of domestic constituency of the United States, but the other is also in terms of tariffs having been lowered on account of global, whether preferential, unilateral, or otherwise, through multilateral agreements, that we've had the coming down of tariffs between 0 and 5 on an average, and if applied world over, But what is also important here is to be able to work out, that there are certain sectors where the United States continues to have peak tariffs, which remain relatively high, And in some of these sectors, India and other member countries like Vietnam, textiles and apparel, for example, footwear, for example, gems and jewelry, for example, all of which we have an advantage, and there exist peak tariffs in the United States. We should be able to do a proper negotiations, ask for tariff inclusion, this to be formalized as an agreement, not shy away if the United States chooses to talk about tariffs also in this arrangement. So that's something that I think the government should quickly do. Badri, maybe a quick look at this should be the order of the, that's the kind of research that we can quickly do to see, even if market access provisions are included in this, we are able to make a case for ourselves and not shy away from negotiating this agreement. That's one. The second bit, about I want to make this point in terms of the strategic aspect, which is as far as the inclusion of the ASEAN countries is concerned. And here I want to say, that this is imperative for India, in the sense that as far as our alignment with ASEAN is concerned thus far, the linear progression that we've had from Look East policy to Act East policy, to what we have today, in terms of, in contradiction to what Badri said earlier, that we've got our agreements with ASEAN and so on, the agreement with ASEAN is under review. The review has not yet begun. The agreement with Japan is under review. The agreement with Korea is under review. And so as far as our trade agreements with countries on these, in Southeast Asia are concerned, and countries as far as Japan and Korea are concerned, these are not operational FTAs at the moment. They're all under review, with reviews either not having been concluded or being not yet being initiated. So this gives us an opportunity to align with ASEAN, in terms of what ASEAN is very good at, in terms of the trade facilitation aspect. That's one of these 6 or 7 elements that we have as far as the trade component of the IPEF is concerned. So, there are many components even to trade, so one should focus as far as trade facilitation is concerned, though my fear is that this trade facilitation is going to go according to the APEC guidelines as far as trade facilitation is concerned. We are not a member of that. Maybe we should also up our, preparation as far as renewing our application to the APEC is concerned. But coming back to ASEAN, I think this is also an opportune moment to align with ASEAN, because strategically speaking, as far as ASEAN is concerned, they are looking for India as a very active partner. And why is that so? Because ASEAN, I think, ASEAN countries particularly have been put in a very, very difficult situation at this point of making a choice between China and the US. As far as IPEF is concerned, it gives them no China. They're willing to enter that. But this is where India can also come in, they're looking for a partner as far as India is concerned. And we should be looking at ASEAN as a partner very actively here, because when multinational corporations today are looking for a China +1 or a China +2, I'm afraid they're not going to look at India as the first choice, but they're going to look at the immediate neighboring ASEAN countries as their first choice to relocate, So it is, it would be wise for us if we would look at the ASEAN countries as our partners in this arrangement, any other arrangement that we can, even if it's reviewing our India-ASEAN agreements, other agreements, to be really looking at aligning with this region, because it is that which will get us towards our objective that has been outlined by Mr. Agarwal of India wanting to be a part of the value chain. Regional is very, very important. This is the most dynamic region. This is where you have dynamism, both in terms of trade as well as value chains. So given the post-Ukraine situation that has arisen and where ASEAN countries have chosen to be a member of the IPEF, let us choose this. If we haven't proceeded with our trade agreements, as far as reviewing our trade agreements with ASEAN is concerned, let us move forward with this. This gives us another opportunity. So our position here should be to push forward for IPEF, to push forward for a trade agreement as far as IPEF is concerned, negotiate it more sensibly. Some of the other things that have been pointed out here, particularly as far as...
Can you come back to it later?
Okay, I'll come back to it later. But Okay, I'll come back to it later.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was excellent inputs again. May I now request Andre? Andre, if you can please take the mic, put on your video as well. Andre, are you there? Hello? Andre? Anyway, he's signed it. No, he's here. Yeah, right. Andre, please.
Yes,
go
hello.
ahead.
Sorry,
Welcome.
I was mute. Thank you very much, Pradeep. Thanks first of all for hosting this this very interesting discussion, and for having such a great group of panelists. Let me just make one point, and it is, you should take it, you know, as a genuine question. And I think the last point that was made by Amita relates to this, but my starting point is really from Montek's presentation. I cannot agree more with sort of the overall strategy that is being put forward here about value chains. I think there needs to be a serious consideration as to whether the discussion is about global value chains or regional value chains. And I think the last point I think indicates that, you know, there may be a tension about that. No, my question really stems from the fact, and I think Montek made that very, very clear. You know, wanting to integrate India more in the global economy, having as a starting point the fact that levels of protection in India is still very high. And I think that has been a difficulty in the strategy of engaging in regional agreements. Montek, you know, is advocating India joining CPTPP, and yes, I think that would be a good idea in principle. But I think one should remember that because of high levels of protection in India, anytime India would join a large grouping like CPTPP, it would create quite a bit of trade diversion. And the trade diversion would be vis-a-vis other partners, including obviously the United States and the European Union. And that, in a sense, would not go in the direction of global value chains. You know, India. I mean, one has often in this seminar made reference to China, and yes, you know, Montek, you said that China had a strategy in 2001 to join the WTO, but remember that meant on a multilateral basis, lowering very, very substantially external protection. And yes, it's only much later that China then and currently does engage in some of the regional agreements. And that is true for a number of other successful countries. The same thing for Japan. Okay, Japan had, you know, high protection, then it engaged into multilateral lowering of its protection. It's again only very, very recently that it did engage in regional agreement that go far deeper than what you can get at the WTO, and it's very relevant for global value chains. So I'm suggesting that I think India needs to reflect both on its multilateral and regional strategy. That if you have a regional strategy that focuses only on one partner, like CPTPP, you would create a lot of trade diversion, and that would not help in the goal of global value chains. I think you need to take that, you need to keep that in mind very much. Or you have to go a bit in what Amita was just talking about, you know, a more regional strategy. You give up on the really global value chain and you go for the regional value chain. But I think that is a choice that you need to make. As far as I'm concerned, I would think that it's more from India's perspective, it would be more valuable to to go for the global value chain strategy, but then keep in mind the danger of having a relationship with one of the partners, and what this would do to India's relation with the rest of the world, and not just vis-a-vis the rest of the world, vis-a-vis India's potential trade diversion and inefficiency that this may produce. Thank you.
Thank you, Andre. Thank you very much. Montek, I'm going to request you to respond to the views expressed by various panelists before I get into the second round. But there is a question. Montek, there is a question also from the audience. How can the benefits of initiatives like IPEF be democratized and help reduce inequity? If we are able to put in place structures so that vulnerable can benefit, can the resistance to such initiatives reforms reduce? Thank you. Over to you. This question plus whatever else you would like.
Well, thank you. First of all, Pradeep, let me thank you for organizing this discussion and bringing such a distinguished and knowledgeable group together. You know, I must say that I'm a little encouraged by the fact that there's a lot more agreement amongst most of the people than you might at one stage have thought. So I just want to sort of highlight a few of the points that have actually been made, maybe respond specifically to one or two. One is that I think Mr. Gopal Agarwal has said that clearly declared that the government is serious about integrating with value chains, etc. I think it's a very important political statement because I think our negotiators need to know that. And, you know, my experience when we did the reforms way back in 1991, our trade negotiators in Geneva had no idea about either the rationale or the desirability of the reforms that we pushed forward. So quite frankly, what Deepak Mishra referred to, you know, we have over the years developed a very negative image amongst our trading partners. And that is that we are not interested in opening up. We hugely value isolation. We have given it even a wonderfully convoluted name called protecting your domestic policy space, which all kind of looks good. It's not an image that we are competitive. We want to join the world, and we can demonstrate that we can compete in an open world. And the only area where we have done that, by the way, I mean, one is certainly in the services area where our chaps have done a wonderful job and acquired a real reputation for it. Somehow this needs to be fed back so that what Mr. Agarwal said is the intention of the government actually gets filtered through into multiple levels of those who negotiate. I think this needs to be made a lot clearer, and hopefully it will be. It can only be made clearer by setting a clear political signal. And I think if this signal that we want to integrate goes across, I think it'll help. Second, you know, Andre Sapir made a very important point about global versus regional. Let me simplify it hugely. You know, when you have a country which integrates with another lot, and the first country has very high tariffs and the others have much lower tariffs, and you reduce the internal tariffs to even lower, 0 or something, then there's a massive trade diversion because the partners that you have now integrated with get a much bigger advantage in accessing your market than you get in accessing theirs. Because if they have average tariffs of only 5%, and you come in with an access that you can bring products in at 0 duty, then your differential advantage compared to those outside the system is only that 5%. But if we have very high tariffs and join with some other countries, they have a huge advantage. And my solution to that, quite honestly, is we should lower our tariffs uniformly and independently of trade negotiation. The big liberalizations that were done in 1991 were not done as part of WTO. It's one of the most amazing misrepresentations in India because The original liberalizers were told you're doing this under pressure from WTO. There was no pressure from, in fact, the real complaint, it's a legitimate complaint. We lowered tariffs, but we didn't lower the bound level of tariffs. And frankly, it was our intention that that ability to lower the bound tariff would be part of our bargaining space in the next round of negotiations. Unfortunately, at that time, the US regarded lowering the bound tariffs to applied tariffs as no advantage at all. Now, this, I think, was a mistake on their part, and it's a pity. But certainly, if we are going to integrate, we need to be able to lower our average tariff much below what it is. It's not difficult to do. I mean, let's face it, we're only talking about 10% adjustments in most of these things. And frankly, over 3 or 4 years, an exchange rate adjustment would offset that. So I think the point he makes, we shouldn't be targeting only a region. We should be open for global. That's valid. But I think it is true that, you know, the way the global value chain and supply chains have worked, this region, this is what Amita's point was, that the East Asian region is very, very important for that. So I think we should look at that, and what she said, I completely agree with, that we haven't started the review of the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement. You know, frankly, if you look at the agenda setting, I mean, I would go further and say that, look, you need to sort of look at a much broader perspective. And I really don't see why we shouldn't put on the agenda joining, let us say, the CPTT, which is currently there. I mean, it doesn't actually include the US at the moment. It doesn't include Europe, but it's quite possible that the US, over a 3-year period or something like that, may well join. It doesn't include China at the moment, or I believe China has applied. But you know, if the geopolitical fault line is important, it's quite possible that India would be a preferred applicant compared to China, and we should take advantage of that if we can. But otherwise, let me say that I take a lot of heart at the fact that there seems to be a fair amount of consensus that we need to move forward.
Montek, there's another question from another very right economist at the Indian Institute of Foreign Trade, Sunita Raju, which I would like to respond before I turn to the panel. If we begin to accept that each country will work towards their interests, including India, there will be give and take, which requires India to prioritize its issues and be willing to open up sectors in which we are comfortable. It is kind of a motherhood statement, but be that as it may, we are negotiating open agriculture in Australia with Australia and digital trade with UK in exchange for concessions and services and movement of natural persons. So clearly our strategies and issues need clarity for making this an effective engagement.
Yeah, you know, my own feeling is that I can see the logic of putting forward a claim on movement of natural persons. But I have a suspicion that that is one area where people will be very restrictive about. They might make some concessions, but not. I don't think this part of the trade, logically, it should be. I mean, labor's another factor of production. But I think there will be the usual consular reasons why progress will not take place very rapidly there. And frankly, I think if we should beware of the situation where unwillingness to move in that area is used by us to argue that the whole thing is unfair, so why should we move? I think we have to recognize that given the size of our labor force and skilled labor force, there would be huge resistances to anything other than a much more limited freedom of movement. Other than that, you know, in terms of which areas we go into, I mean, I'm not competent. In fact, many Deepak and Amita would be much better placed to answer that question. But I think it's a relevant question we should certainly address.
Can I come to the panel for a minute or two each, if they want to respond to any point which was left over, or they would like to respond to any other point made by others?
May I?
Amita, yeah, 2 minutes.
Yeah, just a couple of points, very brief. But on the last point, as far as services is concerned and movement of professionals is concerned, I think India has been too rigid for far too long as far as asking for liberalization only in movement of professionals is concerned. We need to move away from that. It's something else that I also talk about in my book, and something that is around the world now well recognized, that services that are part integrated, that are part of manufacturers, is what we should be looking at. Liberalization of those services along, that is those that are integrated with the manufacturing sector, because that is where we will really find the advantage as far as employment is concerned. Like repairs and maintenance, sales, marketing, branding, all of these are services that today get integrated into the sales or manufacturing products, and these are the services liberalization of which we should start to negotiate for. In fact, there is in the literature, there is a view, that we should move away from this kind of a silo approach to negotiating services and manufactured goods separately. These should be brought in together, because a large part of the value addition as far as exports are concerned is also coming today from services within or integrated with manufactured goods. So I think this is one aspect that one must recognize. Two, in terms of fear of China, as we've been talking about, that if China is the question, then we should not enter into, we did not enter into RCEP, maybe we should do CPTPP, and IPEF is good. China is the largest trading partner, has been so for most of the world. It is the largest trading partner. It is one of the major trading economies of the world. Irrespective of whether or not you sign a free trade agreement, you will have to compete with Chinese commodities. In fact, when you have signed the early harvest scheme with Australia, we have to keep in mind that the big concessions today that we are talking about, that we've gained advantage in, apparel, footwear, we already have 50% of the Australian market being cornered by China, part of it also by Vietnam. So you're already competing with Chinese commodities in Australia. You've opened up there. You've got concessional access to the Australian market through your preferential early harvest scheme. So if you're willing to do it there, why not just do it in other trade agreements as well? Fear of China not entering into agreements, I don't think is the right kind of approach when we are looking at trade agreements. China will be everywhere. It's an applicant to CPTPP as well. There will be frictions. There will be, problems as far as negotiations are concerned, will probably be dragged on, but ultimately it may just enter CPTPP as well. As far as ASEAN and integrating with that is concerned, I think it's a proven thing, that as far as proximate GBC hubs are concerned, there is a certain advantage to integrating with a GBC hub, which many of the Southeast Asian, East Asian economies are. Through that, you gain access also to the global value chains, one. Two, proximity has its own advantage when we talk about integrating with value chains. So in that sense, when you have such a dynamic East Asian region, which is very dynamic as far as trade and GVCs are concerned, there is no reason that we should be avoiding that and looking at countries for trade agreements that are not necessarily hubs of world or global or regional GVCs. UAE, yes, gives us certain advantage in terms of increasing our exports, but it will not give us the advantage of integrating with global value chains. That's one. Two, we can find solace, in saying that, yes, in the last few months, last 1 year, we have increased our exports. Much of this is price effect. Two, the other sectors that have seen an increase, metals and metal products, chemicals, they are not value chain intensive. Why value chains? Because backward integration with value chain is what gives you increased employment opportunities, which is again something that we need today. And lastly, the bottom line, of course, remains that we have to, irrespective of whether we wish to integrate with global value chains or regional value chains, or through regional value chains with global value chains, tariff liberalization and bringing down our tariffs with what has become the norm around the world is something that we need to do unilaterally. So irrespective, that's the bottom line when you have to enter into any kind of a trade agreement. So that's what I'd like to add here.
Thank you. Preetam?
Thank you very much. I just have 3 quick points to make. One, Just to get back, refocus on IPEF, I would like to again posit that we have, as was pointed out by many, existing trade agreements like CTPTP, which can be one area where your traditional items, non-tariff barriers, tariffs, is a framework that already exists. Today, the new normal that we are having, the supply chain disruption, whether it's weaponization of supply chains, the whole data topic, where there's a dichotomy between where we don't have the right frameworks to negotiate these things, and the multilateral framework is perhaps not the appropriate one. Is also where the China is the big elephant in the room, whether it comes to data, whether it comes to supply chain weaponization. So perhaps we need to look at it in that context, that IPEF is more of a strategic engagement and not so much of a trade policy avenue. The reason why I say it is that there are appropriate reasons for looking at global regulation through platforms like IPEF. And I'll give a specific example to illustrate it. Look at what has happened recently with container freight rates and the oligopolistic structure of the container lines, shipping lines. And there the US has recently come up with the US Ocean Shipping Reforms Act. Now, this is a unilateral approach to solve a global problem, which will not work. You will have to have certain structures of cooperation, and perhaps structures like IPEF is that is a step in the right direction. So over focusing on the trade agenda, which is anyway has not been made clear will be a part of it or not, I think is not appropriate. I think it will only be revealed as time goes. Last very quick point to reinforce what Deepak ji was saying. I think this this kind of moving in two cylinders with the industrial policy and trade policy has become even more critical now in this so-called new normal, because the entire regulatory reform aspect of whether it's we're talking about the whole data on digitalization, digital markets regulation, on trade facilitation, on labor reforms, on agricultural reforms, all of these critical areas are critical aspects of domestic reforms, and they feed into industrial policy. And then you have the aspect of industrial policy itself with programs like the product linked incentives, and then it talks to the trade policy arm of it. So if you don't have this full triangulation, we will not be able to engage in a proactive manner. And being part of IPEF, like as Montekji pointed out, when we were engaging in trade policy in the early 2000s in trade negotiations, it provided some impetus to drive this kind of discussions within this whole of government approach. Maybe the IPEF can be a catalyst for the same as we go down the line. Thank you.
Who else would like to comment? Gopalji, please.
Briefly, I just want to underline one thing is that as Mr. Ahluwalia said, that raising custom duty had been counterproductive, and for our MSME sector, we have seen that sometimes increasing the commodity prices had become a counterproductive, and government is moving towards slowly reducing it. Second thing that I want to mention here is that as Mr. Mehta also said, that taxation is a part of this IPEF, and that's very exciting for all of us, because one thing I would like to mention here is some of the global wealth drain, people migrating from one country to other country, is because of difference in the taxation, whether corporate or individual, etc. So if this negotiation is an important area where we can work on at the international level, so our taxation is required to be aligned with the global level, so that some kind of shifting of wealth drain does not take place, and this is an important area where we can work. The third is at the domestic level, I think the government is also focusing, and we also need to focus through our institutions where ESG compliance companies balance sheet should be made, so that investment, etc., also can come. So 3 points that I would like to say.
Thank you very much. Would anybody else like to comment, Badri?
So just a very brief point actually about the the free trade agreements in general and IPEF in particular here. Of course, it's not a trade agreement, but still the point about India's increased participation in these trade agreements is you can think of it in two different ways. One way is to be aggressive and get more and more market access and expand our trade horizons. It's one way of putting it. The other way of more realistic way of thinking about it is that we have lost a lot of opportunities in terms of trade diversions, because many other countries have had such agreements and taken away some of our potential export opportunities there. And now by being part of some of the trade agreements, we are minimizing those losses basically. So we are minimizing some of those trade diversions that happened in the past by getting into this. And this is in response to Dr. Amita's point, a very, very important point that she made about not the need for not to fear China in these agreements. So in fact, the very purpose of many of these agreements is to compete effectively with China, because by getting all this preferred market access, reduced tariffs and barriers and so on, we are in a level playing field with China, because China has already accomplished some of those agreements already. And now when we get into these agreements, we also get into a same level playing. So the limited point I want to make is that these agreements are not only for expanding our trade opportunities, but also to reduce the kind of isolation that we have faced to some extent in the past.
Thank you. Anybody else? Deepak ji? I don't know whether we have any more questions from the audience. At least I don't see any in the chat box. Deepak ji, carry on, please.
No, I don't have anything to add. Thank you very much for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm glad that there's so many ICREER and former ICREER panelists here. So thank you very much. Nothing more to add.
We have, I see a gentleman from the Bangladesh Commerce Ministry, Nasser, here. Would you like to make any comment about regional value chains, for example, which has come up? Mr. Nasser. I don't think, well, he was here possibly and is not there on the table anymore.
May I just
Please.
one point, I'm reminded of it, because as the last point on services and movement of professionals that was being made, movement of professionals, by the way, was included in the comprehensive agreement that India has with Japan. But it was also observed, that as it did not really result in an increased amount of movement, increased number of movement as far as professionals are concerned, because there were other non-tariff barriers that were brought in. So, one has to recognize that it's not so easy to be able to get absorption into the other professional space of another country, even if it is included as a provision in an agreement. There were problems as far as visa granting was concerned. There were problems in terms of language and assimilation in the society. Cultural differences were considered. So many of these have been cited in terms of people who did or wanted to move across as a consequence of the India-Japan comprehensive agreement.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just a reaction to that, Pradeep ji, if I may, 30 seconds.
Please.
So, Amita ji, one of the things we have always failed to recognize is that as far as Mode 4 is concerned, movement of people is concerned, what these agreements actually do is essentially make a commitment to the existing regime. Right, so they are not improving the regime that already exists, like agreeing to the applied tariff rate that you already have in place. So there is nothing extra being offered when a country commits to Mode 4. So nothing changes in terms of the people they're allowing or the categories they're allowing or the visa and consular regulations that are in place. Because not only in the case of Japan, where there are legitimate points as you made about cultural assimilation, language, etc., but even in the case of Malaysia and Singapore, similarly comprehensive agreements where Mode 4 was negotiated, we did not see an increase in the number of people going there for the same reasons, that nothing substantially changes on the ground. You're simply locking your existing regime into place and saying, I will not become worse than this. I'll remain at the level of openness that I am. So that's one of the reasons why, and you will never get more than that in Mode 4 exactly for the same reasons Montekji pointed out. These are there are significant consular and other reasons, and I think post-pandemic those have only been aggravated. Anyway, we are moving to a mode 1 model. I mean, most of us are working from home. A lot of us are working from home. The entire business models for the industries where we would want to, where your skilled labor would want to be exported, that is transferred. That's why I was, underlining this whole point about the new, paradigm shift in technology that is happening in production models and consumption models, both for manufacturing and for services. And the whole digital aspect and the data aspect is so central to it. If you think about computer-aided manufacturing, if you think about 3D printing, if you think about remote manufacturing, all of which are no more, aspects of science fiction, they are mainstream technologies that are being used and will ramp up substantially, transforming the way supply chains work today. Digital becomes a centerpiece of trade. And our reluctance to comprehensively address it we need to really do that. Otherwise, we will be in a difficult positions in the years to come. Thank you. So you're on mute, Pradeep ji.
There is a question from Shagato Ganguly. Indian exports are picking up, but that seems to have dropped off currently. Is this a consequence of India's high tariffs? Can we expect further growth in export given India's present trade policy? The question is open to any panelist.
I don't think it is one can directly ascribe causality to India's high tariffs for our fall in exports. There are multiple factors at play over here. And in terms of actually increasing our exports with our current trade policy, I think a lot needs to, and I would defer to Deepak ji and Amita ji on this. But we also need to look at the structure of our exports that exist today. A lot of our exports is led by 4 or 5 sectors in terms of value. That has changed a little bit over the last 5-6 years, but has not changed substantially. We export mostly petrochemical products, pharmaceuticals. We export some engineering goods, and then there is a whole range of textiles, yarn, fabric, and a big chunk of gems and jewelry, which is in between the value chains there, and that remains our export basket largely. So and a very substantive part of that petrochemicals and that whole aspect, which is I think 15 to 20% depending on which year we're looking at, is dominated by one firm, maybe a couple of firms at best. So that is the structure of exports that we have today. And in order to drive, and that goes back to the whole, industrial policy and value chain integration, I think there's a lot more that needs to be done in terms of diversification and becoming competitive in other sectors that will drive exports much more than trade policy. Because as was pointed out, the applied tariff rates in many of our target markets are not significant. So, trade policy, where they will go from whatever that small amount of applied tariff is to zero, the incremental advantage of that in terms of additional market access space for Indian products, probably not going to be very significant. Besides some of the tariff peaks, which Amita ji rightly mentioned in sectors of interest to us. I'll end there.
Thank you, Peter. We have 2 more well-known economists from abroad, Arne Melchior from Norway, who are our friends, and Mia Mikik. May I request both of them if they would like to make any comments for about 5 minutes? Arne and Mia, I hope you're there. I see you logged in.
The microphone. Okay. Thank you very much, Pradeep, for.
Arne,
yes.
Go ahead, please.
Okay. So thank you very much for inviting me to this very interesting discussion. So let me just come with a brief reflection from the small country in Europe that kind of benefited from China's growth in the sense that they drove up our commodity prices and drove down our import prices. So in this sense, Norway, we phased out our textile industries in the 1960s, so we were less severely kind of affected by the rapid industrial growth of China. So of course we are all shocked by the events during the last years, the kind of the trade policies of Mr. Trump in the USA, which led to a confrontation with China. We were waiting for Mr. Biden to kind of overcome this antagonization with China, which has not really happened. So in a way, some of the perceptions under Trump has been inherited. And I perceive that American trade policies are kind of still in a kind of quagmire with kind of strong domestic political forces limiting the margin of maneuver in trade policy. So, of course, the confrontation with Russia has led to a further escalation of this securitization of trade, which you had under Trump with the steel tariffs, etc. So my kind of maybe naive perspective from Norway is that we have not exploited the potential for dialogue and the use of the multilateral system. I think there is something to be achieved with China, for example, in the field of subsidies. So with a serious dialogue in the field. So my kind of signal, since the arrangement is about US power politics in the world, is that we should not support maximum antagonism with China. We need a dialogue with China within different fora, and then we have to pursue different tracks. So in a way, that is my reflection, that we should keep the door open for dialogue. I also think that the experience of the last 30, 50 years is, of course, that Asia has been the engine of the world economy with the fastest growth. That can also happen in the future decades. So the policies related to Asia are of key importance for Europe, USA, and of course for the Asian countries. Yes, so that's my message.
Thank you, Arne. Thank you very much. Mia, are you there? Mia. I thought I saw Mia. She's gone. Anyway, with that, I just wanted to respond one thing. I and Deepak Mishra, who's leaving or has left, we were there at another forum yesterday in Delhi, and one of the issues which keeps on coming up is China factor in our discussions. China is driving many of these new arrangements at the same time. There are challenges that we face not only in the area of trade, but also climate change. And therefore, what we need to understand is, can we ignore China? If we want multilateralism to progress, and of which all these are parts and components, we'll have to keep China inside the room and not outside the room. Outside the room, they will only become more spoilers. And for keeping them inside the room, then we'll have to think about how do we become frenemies rather than enemies. That's the other thing. Okay, fine, we can't become friends, but let's not remain as enemies at the same time. One way or the other, the MC12, for example, at the WTO, which happened, we had this problem of Russia and Ukraine, yet people met in the negotiating rooms in order to push forward the fisheries subsidies agenda. People were worried whether you can have a fisheries subsidies agreement without Russia in the room, and it finally did happen. So if people decide that, look, in spite of the fact is that there is animosity or anathema, you cannot ignore each other. You have to bring it inside the room and then take a very clear view, whether it's compartmentalized or comprehensive. Then how do we move forward in this thing? And as I said, one of the things which the Indian Prime Minister, Honorable Narendra Modi, has said very clearly, and of which we are great supporters, is how do we boost multilateralism? And for that, the agreement at the WTO was a great achievement, that at least it did not backslide. It has moved forward. Climate change is the next issue. Now, this issue is coming up in the G20 meeting, which will happen in India next year, of which India is the president. And so that was the issue where I and Deepak were there at a meeting yesterday organized by a civil society forum in order to guide India as to what would happen. And that is the point which I made, is that you cannot ignore China. And ignoring China would be at your own peril. Let's not forget they still are a large part of the global economy, large part of the global population, and large part of the global geography as well. Having said that, we have to live with that. I don't know what is happening in Taiwan, for example. And we can keep on talking about many of these things. Saber rattling will continue. At the same time, we cannot ignore having a dialogue with China. Thank you very much. And may I request Vipul? Vipul, are you there? Vipul Chatterjee? Vipul? Yeah, please. Last remarks. And before that, I must thank my colleague Advayot for having organized this, or did all the background work for this particular event and other events before. And there will be other events in the future as well, which I'll come to. Vipul, over to you.
Thank you. Let me thank all panelists, Dr. Mr. Ahluwalia to begin with, and of course others for this fascinating discussion. I think we have got more inputs from it rather than as against finding answers to some of the questions which are there in our mind. And getting these inputs are also important in order to make incremental progress on this debate and discussion on how we can have better trade integration. And Mr. Mehta has repeatedly referred to another debate which is going on in a number of our forums, where I think Martin Wolf, he has summarized it very, very nicely the other day, I think yesterday, that what India should do. So if we can follow those
on Deepak Mishra's comments.
Yeah. If we can follow those things, of course, there are political barriers or political hiccups, I would say, that will arise. More than that, I think is which all of us need to understand, particularly our political class, current regime, is all these reforms are good. The content there is no issue with the content, but it's the process of reforms. That's where I think we are faltering. We need to be more open, more consultative with the larger set of people, including civil society organizations. Of course, there will be some lunatics. We know who they are, and we can ignore them. That would be a good thing to do. But there are also sane voices who we need to engage with in debates and discussion. After all, we are a democracy. We are not like China. And we value our democracy. So on that note, let me thank all of you once again. We are the 75th year of our independence, and I hope that the next 25 years are going to be very, very crucial for our benefit, for our development, for all of us, not just we Indians, but for the global community and humanity as a whole. On that note,
Vipul, just one postscript to what Vipul said. As I said in my opening remarks, there's another article which has been written by Montec, India's Trade Policy, based upon Amita's book, excellent book, which is recommended highly, and so are we going to recommend, except it is priced very high, and I hope she gives us one. 12,000 rupees, my God. So, having said that, we'll probably summarize both the debates. There is an excellent debate which has happened on this particular article, which refers to Amita's book, and this particular debate, and we'll run it as a singular debate at a later date with the same community, including Arne, Andre, and Mia. Mia has gone. So we have some excellent participants in this group so far, and particularly Gopal Krishna Agarwal from the economic spokesperson for the BJP, and hoping that he would be able to get hold of some of the party paratics and or MPs to come into this particular debate so that we are able to orient and educate them better about why it is important for India to open up. And that so many of us are all gung-ho about India being able to do it. And as Monte commented on Gopal Krishna Agarwal's comment that we're open to global value chains. If you ask me, and there's one thing which has not come up in discussion are the granular details of value chain. It's mind-boggling. Pritam would know what I'm talking about. Now, many of you theorists may not know what are the granular details. What nut goes into what bolt, what kind of spanner will be needed, 32 spanner or 28 spanner or 22 spanner. Now, all that is a matter of detail. All that is a part of value chain. So we'll have to find a way as to how manufacturing can be sort of conjointed cross boundaries. With that little long postscript, I must also continue to join Vipul in thanking all of you, and that in another month's time we should be able to have the second debate on this particular thing based on both these excellent articles by Montek. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Arne, for joining. And Andre and Mia in absentia, and Mr. Nasser from Bangladesh. I don't know why you didn't speak. Anyway, thank you for joining.